All right, we are back for video 2 and we are in the home stretch. What we have left to talk about is chapter 14, which starts on page 176. And then I'm going to make some of my own recommendations for what we're getting started on. Once we've gotten through that, then you are good to go and you can complete the rest of the work on your own. Of course, I'll be around to support you if you do need to email me and ask any questions about anything in any of these videos or about the practice activity that I'll ask you to complete as well. Just let me know. So in case you hadn't guessed yet, the assignment that we're moving into is an essay where you're going to summarize. What we're going to do is we are going to read two different articles and we're going to be discussing them. And then I want you to summarize for me what you read in those articles. The goal is to show me that you've been able to read them effectively and accurately. And then you're going to use that to launch into your own response. So you will respond to the ideas in that article with your own opinion. So this is going to be a summary and response essay, starting with what someone else said by summarizing that, just like we talked about in chapter 2, and then responding with what you want to say in response to them. So really, even though we just talked about summarizing, we're not going to be getting to that yet. The first step really is starting by reading, and that is what chapter 14 is about. It's about reading academic texts, which may be complex, or I hate to say it, but they may be kind of boring. They may not be interesting to you, but we still have to read these academic texts in order to understand what's going on in our field, to understand what's going on in the world, and then to be able to respond with our own thoughts. So all the notes that I gave you about summary, we'll actually be picking up with those in a couple of weeks. So make sure you have them in your notes to refer back to like 2 weeks from today when I say, hey guys, we're moving into summary. I'm going to need you to dig those out. But what we're talking about in chapter 14 is immediately relevant to us because we have to know, we have to have some like skills in our tool belt to bust out for reading these texts that I'm going to assign to you. So we're picking up on page roughly 176. Honestly, I'm kind of starting on 178. I'm going to jump ahead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add some more to the notes that we were taking earlier by recapping what this chapter says are the major recommendations for reading these academic texts. All right, so let me get my notes pulled up here. All right. Strategies for reading academic texts. All right, one of the first recommendations that this chapter makes is that when we are reading these, we need to imagine that the author is responding to other people. So let's see, where do they say it? The trick in reading for the conversation, this is the bottom of 178, is to figure out what views the author is responding to and what the author's own argument is. Or to put it in terms used in this book, to determine what the they say is. You're going to hear me say that a lot. What's the they say? So determine what the author is responding to. Oops. And what his or her argument is. So when you're reading something, try to figure out where else have you heard about this topic. Have you read something in the news about it? Have you heard other people talking about it in one of your other classes? Is it something that you just happen to know something about? When you can figure out where else you've seen the topic, you can figure out what the greater conversation is that the author is responding to. And that can help contextualize the argument, help us understand why someone is making the claims that they are. All right, another recommendation. I'm kind of going through this chapter and I'm looking at the headings. That's what we did in class today. So the next thing is we have to be aware when texts don't do that summarizing for us. If you remember in chapter 1, they were talking about that problem at the conference with the speaker who was talking about Dr. X. They said that they didn't have any context for the topic because the speaker didn't give any of it. They didn't give any background on why they were talking about Dr. X. So when that happens, it means that the chapter refers to it, that they say is unstated. They haven't told us why the argument matters or what they're responding to. When that happens, the authors of our book say that we have to do things like watch for shifts in voice. Let me find exactly where that page is. Changes in voice is how they put it. I cannot find the page number, but I'm going to add it. I remember that this is one of their recommendations. This might be things like transition words. When you hear someone say, but, there's the but, you know that they're going to say something different from what they've been saying. That's a change in voice or a shift in voice. Words like however, or things like as a result. These are clues to us that the author is about to shift into what they want to say. So those can be clues for us when we're looking for an author's argument or when we're trying to figure out what the point is. You know, if you're reading something, you're like, what is the point of all this? Look for those shifts in voice, and they can be clues for you to help you figure out when the author is shifting into what they want to claim. All right, another thing that we have to watch out for when we're reading, challenging texts. It's not always just academic texts. That's what I've labeled it, but challenging texts in general is, when it's something that nobody has talked about before. That's another one of the headings here. Then this can be particularly challenging because sometimes we can't see what the greater conversation is that they're responding to. But, there's that saying, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Have you heard that before? This is kind of, a truism. Anytime we try to come up with something new, it's usually because we're trying to connect it to something else that we know. Let me give you an example that might better illustrate what I'm talking about. The COVID vaccine. That didn't just come out of nowhere. It is a new vaccine. It is a breakthrough. But it's not just poof, we came up with a vaccine. We had to study other vaccines that we had, right? There have been other forms of this virus out there, and so we looked at those viruses. We looked at other kinds of vaccines. We looked at new technology that we were coming up with, and we used all of that in order to create this new vaccine. But we were looking at other things that already existed. And so anytime we're trying to come up with something new, they refer to this in the chapter as like trying to fill a gap or to find a niche. A lot of times when people are trying to stand out with their argument, they're trying to find something that's new. No one said this before. They're trying to come up with something new. But when we are building our ideas, we're always building them from something else. So when the topic is something no one has talked about before, we have to look for connections to other related fields or topics. Find something that they've built from that helps contextualize where this new thing is coming from. All right, so we're moving into the heading, reading particularly challenging texts. Sometimes things are really hard. We don't know what they're talking about. This might be because maybe they're talking about topics or ideas that we're not familiar with. Or they may be using language that we're not familiar with. They may be using vocabulary that's not meant for us. Maybe we're not part of that field. And that can be a challenge. So some strategies there. First of all, vocabulary is an easy one. Look up any unfamiliar words. Define them in your own words. I think the chapter says, literally, put things into your own words. That's one of the first ways. If you're not understanding a vocabulary term, you have to look it up. Look up any unfamiliar topics. We have this lovely tool called Google. We have Wikipedia, right? We have access to tools that can help us figure things out. So take the time to look up anything that's unfamiliar to you. And then the chapter says that it's really important to build a bridge. And what they mean is that you want to build a bridge to your own experiences. Try to find things that the text is talking about that you do understand, and then look for ways that it relates to your own life, personal experience. Or you might look for connections to the world around you. You know, did you read something in the news recently that you think is similar to what's going on here? That's building a bridge. When we can make connections between something that's unfamiliar to something that is familiar, then we are more likely to understand it or to retain that information. So these are important strategies for reading these academic texts. Now, I will admit they're kind of nebulous, right? Like there are some concrete strategies in there, like look up an unfamiliar word. But sometimes when we're looking for these connections to other fields or other topics, or when we're trying to determine what the author is responding to, that can be hard unless you have a starting place. So now I'm going to give you my recommendations for reading critically these difficult texts. And actually, I'm not going to call it recommendations, suggestions, actions. That's what I referred to them as class today, so I want to be consistent. Actions for reading critically. All right. One of the first things I recommend is preview the text. Previewing might mean skimming through the text. You might look for headings. I always recommend that with the They Say, I Say chapters. If you can look at the headings, they'll give you clues about the topics that are coming in the chapter. You might also look at the author. Look up who the author is. Google them. Check out their Wikipedia page. Find out information about them or their experiences. It's going to tell you something about their background. And it's probably also going to tell you how maybe their opinion was shaped and what their opinion might be in the topic. You might also look up the article itself, see if there's anyone who has commentary on it. Look at the title, see if the title gives you any clues. Those are really important ways to kind of figure out before you even read what the text is going to be about. Next thing is annotate the text. Annotate just means to make notes on something. When you make these notes, jot down questions you have. If there's something you're not familiar with, write that down. Look up and define any vocabulary words. Write down places that you make connections to something else. If you're like, oh, this reminds me of the time that I did this thing, make that note out in the margin. That is building that bridge that we talked about earlier. Another thing to do is highlight or underline things that you like or that are particularly striking to you. That's my favorite way to read, is with just a pen or a highlighter in hand, and I'll just make those notes. I thought I'd show you a copy of a text that I've annotated here. You can see where I've got stuff in the margins here. You can see how I've done some bracketing. We're going to be doing some bracketing in class soon. You can see where I've underlined all throughout it. I'll do this with anything that I'm reading. I've got one of my textbooks that I used for my other class. You can see, same thing, I've just underlined and highlighted and made notes all over the place in this text. That helps me. And spoiler alert, highlighting is going to make your life easier later on in this unit. I'm going to make you incorporate a quote from one of the texts that we're reading into your essay. And if you have highlighted or underlined as you've read, then you go back to those places and you can look at them and choose your quotes more easily that way. So make notes. Anything's fair game as you're reading through the texts. The next thing that you can do, you can annotate, you can do what's called text to self, text to text, and text to world. You may have done something like this before. It's a pretty common strategy now in most schools. When you get done reading something, take a minute to write down your reactions and note any place where the text that you read had a connection to you and your personal experience. Is there something that's happened in your life that seemed familiar to you that you can relate to that text? Then make a connection between the text that you just read and something else you've read, whether it's something for another class, a newspaper article, whatever, just something you've read, a favorite book. It can be fiction, but make a connection from the text that you're currently reading to something you've read in the past. And then make a connection from the text you're reading to the world. What's something going on globally in the rest of the world that other people are experiencing that you can relate to from the text? Make those connections. Again, that's going to help you build a bridge. All right, then you can contextualize. Contextualizing means that you might look up words or things that you're not familiar. Any of these strategies that you're doing up here, that's contextualizing because it's helping you better understand what's going on in the article. So take a moment, look stuff up. There's a way you can do this actually in our upcoming article. It's going to reference things from the year 1999. Look up what was going on with those time periods.